Well, welcome back. I hope you're all having a good experience in this online environment. This is a big learning curve, I'm sure, for all of us. I know I've made a number of mistakes that have cost me time, and we all that always happens when we learn new things. So we're looking forward to going forward here. I do want to talk to you about an introduction to ethics. So let's talk about some basic issues involved with ethics as we move to that area of philosophy known as axiology. If you remember right, that has to do with value, and ethics is a major component of that category of ethical discourse. So let's talk a bit about terminology, get our terms right. The first term we need to be aware of is called moral skepticism. Now, we've already run into another kind of skepticism that had to do with knowledge, epistemological skepticism. David Hume was probably one of the main folks there. So, like knowledge skepticism, moral skepticism holds that there just are no valid moral principles at all. Either we can't know them or they aren't there to know. So a moral skeptic just doesn't believe there are any moral principles at all, either individual or social or come from God or anything else. So that's moral skepticism. You don't find much moral skepticism these days, but it is a possible position, I suppose. More commonly, you find moral relativism. Now, much of this particular slideshow presentation is going to be focusing upon subjective relativism and cultural relativism. These two relativisms are really quite common in the way people think about ethics. I think these are the default positions of many modern, I should say Western people in the developed world. For some reason, this seems to be a default position. I think it is so attractive probably because of it seems to be emphasizing and allow for a great deal of tolerance. But as I will mention later on, I think we need to give some pause to whether this is really a tolerant position or not. But essentially, moral relativism holds that there just are no universally valid moral principles. Morality is a matter of human invention, either at the individual level or at the cultural level. Cultures create different kinds of values that they hold valuable, to help them to survive or to certain parts of it to flourish. And that just becomes what is ethics for that particular culture. And the same applies to individuals that we call subjective relativism. Usually in subjective relativism, morality is a matter of personal choice. You simply choose to do certain things, and it doesn't arise beyond your own personal choice. Again, we'll have much more to say about these two as we go along today. Another term you need to be aware of is called moral objectivism, and this is the idea that at least some moral principles, at least one, are universally valid, that either for the individual or for societies, that there is some rule that applies everywhere. If I were in class, I would ask you, what might be a good candidate for moral objectivism? And you would all say things like, don't steal, don't kill, don't murder, don't lie. Now, those are the kinds of candidates for universally valid moral principles that many moral objectivists would say, this is true. It's objective, notice, because it's something that's outside of my preferences. It doesn't matter what I want or what you want or what our culture wants. It's simply true. It's something like the belief that Earth is the third planet from the sun. That's true whether anybody believes it or not. And so moral objectivism would say there's at least one moral principle that's true whether anybody believes it or practices it or not. So you have to think about moral objectives, something like objective moral truths that we go out and discover rather than create. Moral absolutism is the idea that if there are any objective moral principles, there are no exceptions to them. They must be applied in the same way in all cultures. So if you have a prohibition against killing, it's got to be applied in Indonesia in the same way that it's applied in Montana. It's got to be applied, a prohibition against lying needs to be applied in Japan, just like it is applied in the in Russia, let's say. So that'd be moral absolutism. Objective moral principles allow for no exceptions, and they have to be applied in all cultures in the same way. So those are just a few terms. Vaughan in your textbook talks about at least some of these. So you might want to review that to make sure that you're clear on those terms. But let's talk about some assumptions of ethics. Some of the assumptions that we'll find out later on in this presentation are challenged by critics of ethics. But there's just some basic assumptions that you probably already are aware of, but which it might be a good idea for us to bring to conscious awareness. One of these is that just simply the realization that some ways of living are better than other ways of living. And this applies to both individuals and society. So think about yourself. If you've ever thought, I have a habit, whether it's maybe not an immoral thing you do or have done, but maybe it's simply a discipline. You'd like to diet, or you'd like to exercise more, or you'd like to be kinder to strangers, or something like this. If you have ever thought that you should do something, whether lose weight, exercise more, be kinder, you in yourself are suggesting that there's a way you should live your life that is different from the way you are then currently living it. So ethics assumes that there are certain ways of living that are better than other ways of living. If someone lives a dissolute life, they become an alcoholic their entire life, their marriage breaks up, their family leaves them, they end up in destitution and on the street because they can't pay their bills. We might have a lot of grace and mercy for someone who falls into that kind of situation. But at the same time, we would at least, if we knew the entire span of their life, we'd probably look back and say, they should have done something differently here, or they should have done something differently here. Our judgments about those kinds of things the implication of those is that there are some ways of living that are better than others. This is true of individuals, as I've mentioned. It's also true of our society. The very idea that our society is better than it was before, or should be better in some way, is an implication of an ethical principle. Right now, politicians, President Trump and others are being attacked or praised for the way they're handling this coronavirus outbreak. The idea that we should handle it differently suggests that there is a better way to handle it. And so this is just a very basic claim that oftentimes when we talk about ethics, we don't really apply it. We tend to, it seems in my experience, when I talk to students frequently and others, it seems as if we think that any way of living, no matter how it might be, is perfectly equal morally to any other way of living. And I think upon ethical reflection, there's some real problems with that particular view. Another assumption is that we should strive to achieve a better life individually. This is simply making the claim that I might recognize that there are better ways of living, but I might, I guess, at the same time say, I don't want to live that way, or I shouldn't even strive for it. So this view says, the second assumption is that if there is a better way of living our lives individually or as society, we should try to do it. This is simply focusing on the motivational aspect of ethics, that if there is a better way of living, we should strive for it by definition. And then a way of summarizing what I just said is to say that ethics is a normative discipline. It's not merely making descriptions about how the world is, or about how I'm living my life, or how our society is. It's making claims about how we should be. So that's what we mean by normative. Normative here means rule that we should strive for. That's the idea. And it's to be distinguished from merely describing things a particular way. Right now I'm looking out my window and I'm describing that it recently rained and there are dog toys in my driveway. My dogs want to throw their toys around. Simply observing those kinds of things is one thing, but to say they should be different, there shouldn't be water in my driveway right now, or those toys shouldn't be there, is to make an additional step beyond observation. And normative disciplines are making should statements, not are statements, A-R-E statements. Now, when it comes to ethics, oftentimes we will focus on the differences between cultures. I look at a culture, say, of tribes, people in the Amazon or in Somalia, or people living in Tokyo or Timbuktu or in New York City, and I see that there are very different ways of living one's life. And we have to recognize that these are cultural differences. And if we look back not just at the current cultures, but we study our history, we know that the ways human beings have organized themselves and lived have been very different from time and place. The way the ancient Egyptians lived was far different than the way the Greeks lived, which was far different from ways Assyrians lived or Babylonians or ancient Chinese people lived. It was all a very different way of living one's life with different kinds of ethical rules. We have to recognize that different societies do have very different moral codes, both currently and if we look at history, they're very different. I am told, for example, that the Eskimos, we now call them Inuit, I-N-U-I-T, that the Inuit society is very different from my own. It exposes infants rather regularly. And I'll talk more about that a bit later. But if you've ever done any world travel at all, you quickly recognize that people view the world very differently than we do here in the United States. Significantly differently at any rate. And there are some deep cultural differences in terms of food, but also in terms of mores and the things that they approve of, the things they don't approve of, the type of practices that they do. One stark example, if we go back way back in history, this sentence, child sacrifice, was practiced among the Aztecs. As many of you know, the Aztecs was an ancient civilization living in Central America, during the first and second, early part of the second millennium. And many of them practiced child sacrifice, sacrifice a child to appease the gods. So this sentence is true. It's a marker. It's simply recognizing cultural differences, that they did this sort of thing back then. Notice that this is merely a descriptive claim about cultural facts. It doesn't say about what things should be or whether they should have practiced child sacrifice. So the reason I have this slide and want to point this out is oftentimes cultural relativism, that we're going to talk about in just a moment, jumps from the recognition that cultures are different to the claim that it's okay that they should be. And while we can recognize that cultures are different from place to place, it doesn't always mean that they should be different from place to place. And I'll bring that out in these slides to come. So what is cultural relativism as opposed to simply cultural difference? First, cultural relativism holds that there is no universal moral code. There is no moral principle that is applicable to every culture that does exist or that might exist. There is no universal moral principle. Whatever a culture considers moral is moral for that culture at that time. So if the Aztecs practiced child sacrifice, that was what they should do. Remember, this is a normative discipline. It's not merely recognizing that they did it, but it's saying that it was right for them to do it. And so that's the idea of cultural relativism. It is a normative theory. It's not only saying that cultures differ from place to place and time to time, but it's making a stronger claim. That is, that no set of values should be or can be required of all cultures. And here is where it often jumps from cultural differences to cultural relativism. One of the reasons why this is a very appealing jump is that in our modern sensibilities, the embracing cultural relativism as the way to go makes it appear that we are non-judgmental of other cultures. Who are we to judge the Aztecs? Who are we to judge the Inuit or the Asians or Africans or Saudi Arabians or whoever it might be, or the Welsh? Who are we to judge those people's cultures? And so if cultural relativism is true, we can just embrace tolerance because it has such a big advantage for us. And so I think this is one of the reasons why cultural relativism is so appealing to our modern sensibilities. It seems that it is tolerant, that it will allow all kinds of things. I want to suggest to you that that's not true, it's not true in practice, and it's not true in principle. Let me provide a stark explanation as to why cultural relativism does not necessarily, and I would argue should not, support tolerance. I want to talk to you about a rather delicate subject, but it's called female genital mutilation. Some of you may have heard about this before. It's practiced by 26 African nations and a number of Southeast Asian nations. Studies indicate that over 2 million young women each year, many willingly, undergo a procedure by which their sexual organs are mutilated in a surgical procedure. This picture that you have in front of you now is the photograph that was taken by a reporter, Abigail Hayworth, who went to observe these procedures going on, in which she saw, she says, 248 girls operated on and their genitals were mutilated. Now you might be wondering, why would anybody be willing to do this? Well, those who practice it give several reasons why they do it. One is, they claim, that it reduces sexual promiscuity, because by mutilating the genitals of women, it makes sex unpleasant. And the idea is that if we make it unpleasant, women will be less likely to be promiscuous, that is, have sex outside the bonds of marriage with a man. They also argue, for that reason, we'll have fewer unwanted pregnancies among unmarried people. So that's a kind of societal reason why we would do that. They also argue that women who undergo this are more likely to be faithful to their husbands. They're less promiscuous. There's a very strong traditional element to it. It's just something they do. And then also, as you might imagine, in a society that practices this, it becomes an expectation. And so women who do not undergo it in certain cultures are considered immature and unclean and even potentially promiscuous. So many women who do this willingly, these are teenagers typically, undergoing the procedures, they do it willingly because of the social pressure. That is, they have been taught and enculturated to think of this as a female rite of passage, of becoming a responsible female adult, and a way of presenting themselves to a potential husband as someone who has done what she should do to maintain fidelity in a marriage. And here you have an example of this going on. I don't have it on a slide, but when I was living in Minnesota, there were a very large number of immigrants from Somalia, and apparently that this is practiced among some Somali tribes. It was practiced so much in Minneapolis that the state of Minnesota outlawed the practice because it was happening too often. Now, as you can also imagine, this is going on in other countries. A number of Western groups, humanitarian groups, had advocated that this should stop, that it should be made illegal, that it's a violation of basic human rights, and it shouldn't be happening. But the reason why I mention this, as indelicate as it is this. If cultural relativism is true, then our attitude towards these cultures, I suppose, should be just to leave them alone. But in fact, that's not what we do. When they move here to the United States, we make the practice illegal, and we try to advocate that the countries that do allow it stop allowing it because of this idea of these transcendent human rights. So cultural relativism, though, would say, well, this is just the way they practice their lives, and who are we to tell them otherwise? So as you can indicate, as been indicated, there are some real problems with cultural relativism, and this is, your textbook goes over these as well. One, if every culture is, if cultural relativism is true, then every culture is morally infallible. That is, whatever a culture says are their ethical principles are correct ethical principles. So if a country in Southeast Asia practices female genital mutilation, then it's right for them to do it. If a country practices sex slavery, it's right for them to do it. If a country encourages pedophilia, it's right for them to do it. If a country practices human trafficking and slavery, it's right for them to do it. You can see the problems here. It runs against our moral intuitions. Another problem that's on the slide there, as you can see, is that no society can judge another. Now, one might think that this is a good thing. It would mean maybe fewer interventions from the West. The United States might not have invaded Afghanistan or Kuwait or Iraq or any of these countries if we fully embrace the notion of cultural relativism. Moreover, many of us would say, well, that's a good thing. Why should we be trying to tell those people how to live? On the other hand, while we might see some benefits to cultural relativism, suppose a society waged war on its neighbors so that they could take slaves from them. If cultural relativism is true, should we intervene in that? Should we allow that culture to be aggressive towards their neighboring countries? If cultural relativism is true, it seems we would have to just say, well, that's the way they live. If they want to invade their neighbors, we should let them. Saddam Hussein in the early 90s invaded Kuwait. The American forces and others intervened. And yet if cultural relativism is true, we should just leave them alone, I guess. Hitler invaded Poland to begin the Second World War. He exterminated a number of Jews. I guess if we fully embrace cultural relativism, we'd have to say something like, well, I guess Nazis just don't like Jews. That's their cultural practice, and we just let them go. But in fact, you can see how ridiculous and really heinous, morally objectionable that kind of view is. In 1994, 500,000 to 1 million Rwandan Hutus killed their neighboring tribes people, the Tutsis. Over almost 1 million people were butchered in that. I guess if cultural relativism is true, we should have just backed up and done nothing. And we did very little, but what we look back on that and say we should have done more to stop that kind of genocide. And so, yes, no society could judge another, but that just really goes against our standards of morality, really. And the other problem here, of course, is that any view of cultural relativism, if you think the benefit is tolerance, we have to be, under cultural relativism, we have to be tolerant of intolerant cultures and intolerant practices. But that doesn't seem to be right. If it's the culture of Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, why couldn't we also say it's part of our culture to stop those kinds of invasions and then to act violently towards them, to intervene? So the idea of tolerance being a benefit of cultural relativism is really comes about because of a lack of comprehensive thinking about this particular view. Another problem is the problem of moral progress. If differences between cultures are merely differences and not an improvement, then we can't think about our own culture or any culture as progressing from one time to the next. We tend to think that the slave trade that was gone on in America in the 19th century was not a good thing, and now that we don't do that anymore, we think, at least in that regard, we're better. And yet, if cultural relativism is true, we can't describe the situation now as progress. We have to describe it as simply being different, and that's just strange. And the same kind of implication comes to moral reformers. What is a moral reformer doing if moral progress isn't true? They're simply advocating that we change something, but not for moral reasons. But of course, that's ridiculous. Moral reformers like Martin Luther King Jr. advocated on the behalf of African Americans, saying that it was immoral for us to treat them the way we had been doing up until the Civil Rights Act and even up until today. So the idea that somehow, what do we do with moral reformers if cultural relativism is true? It just doesn't work very well. And so cultural relativism has a host of problems if lived consistently.